All over the world, people are coming together and training to become better versions of themselves and serve those in need. This show is a celebration of that movement. This is the Hero Forge.
Welcome to the Hero Forge. This is your host, Andy Fisher. Thanks so much for joining us. You can find out more about our work and the show notes for this episode over at theheroforge.com. With me today for this episode is Rodney King, who is one of the world's most renowned martial arts and self-protection coaches. He's the founder of Crazy Monkey Defense, which you're going to learn more about in this episode. Growing up on the south side of Johannesburg in South Africa, he learned all about the challenge of interpersonal violence the hard way. And he went on to immerse himself deeper still into that abyss by working in some of the toughest nightclub doors in the city. But what I find so fascinating about Rodney's journey is that he transitioned from hard man to what he refers to as anti-hard man. And he's an inspirational, true example of how we don't need to be defined by our past. So Rodney's an author, entrepreneur, leadership consultant, philosopher, and a man who walks his talk. He's truly a Renaissance man, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the Hero Forge today. So welcome, Rodney.
Hey, Andy, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I've got to say that I came across your work probably years ago now on YouTube, and amongst my friends who train in self-protection, you were somebody whose ideas we often sort of threw around and talked about. And more recently, I've invested in some of the online resources that you've had available, and I've worked my way through the CIA system, Street Jits, and I'm also looking at the bare knuckle work that you've got. They're great instructional resources. So I wanted to celebrate that before we go into your own story a little bit.
Well, awesome, man. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And probably my question for you is, what part of it did you really enjoy the most? Like, what kind of stood out for you?
Yeah, so for me, it's a couple of things. First of all, that you're not afraid to call BS on stuff that is at odds with your experience based on hard-won lessons. And I kind of came across I've on a similar journey to you, but with a much more kind of privileged upbringing, in that I had 20 odd years of traditional martial arts, then worked the doors throughout a lot of what I learned because I didn't find it had application, and put much more emphasis on de-escalation and managing space and so on. So on one level, I really value what you're doing because you are helping people, or trying to help people, to shortcut a lot of that journey that there can be a lot of wasted time and energy and unfortunate pain involved in that. So I celebrate that, but I also love the way that your system all kind of plugs together. So particularly the CM1, CM2, so for people who aren't familiar with this, you have very rational, intelligent ways of managing ranges in interpersonal violence that beautifully transition from one stage to another, and you never get lost in the quagmire of technique. You're far more about principles that work under pressure.
Yeah, I think you described it 100% accurately. I think that, as you were saying that, I was just thinking, so it's kind of interesting, to me, you were saying that, in the past, my name would be thrown around, you guys would play around with some of my ideas, which is fantastic. And I love that. But one of the things I've also noticed over the years is that people tend to cherry pick things, right? Yeah. So now that you've actually done a little bit of homework and you've gone and looked at what I actually teach, you realize, as you noted, that there's a progression, that there are different components that fit together seamlessly. Yeah. And what tends to happen a lot of times when people see my work, the thing that they fixate on is the defensive stuff that we do, like the defensive blocking action. Mm-hmm. They pull that out, they go and shove that into stuff that they do that isn't functional to begin with. And then they think that they know what I'm doing. Yeah. When if you go through the stuff that I teach and you go through the programs like you've done, you realize that although it is important, of course, it's an integral part of the program, the defensive action, but it's actually a small part of the program.
Sure.
And that there's an entire kind of methodological aspect behind it. There's a method behind what I do. There is obviously principles, as you noted. And, you can just take that defense And, you're probably going to do a little bit better than most other people, but you'll never get the fullness of the experience because you don't understand the rest of the components that build into it.
Mm-hmm. I think Bruce Lee said it, or whether it was him directly, or I know he was renowned for quoting other people, but he talked about there being no such thing as an effective segment of a totality. And I think that echoes very much in your work as well. Like you can take one aspect of it and say, okay, this is a nice idea. Like you talk about riding the storm, for example, which it's for, again, people listening who might not be involved in combative arts. It's this recognition that when you're dealing with interpersonal violence, and if you're trying to de-escalate, but then it kicks off, it's unrealistic to expect to be able to block and counter and go straight into some sophisticated system. The reality is going to be that you're going to get a rain down of attacks, which you might need to weather or ride the storm, as you call it, before you're in a position to transition to counterattack. And that was one really good example for me of where it just rang true to my experience, where so often I would be trying to execute on techniques that I was proficient in, but there was this gap between what I trained in the dojo and what the reality of life was presenting me with. And that's what I loved about your system. It's saying that this is the reality. I know you might like it to be different, and I know that your lineage might profess it to be different. But the truth of the matter is that most people teaching haven't had real world experience. And so it's atrophied along the way. And it's not that people are trying to pull the wool over their eyes or other people's eyes. I think it's just that they fail to recognize the map as not being the territory because they're not road testing in everyday life.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's a big part of it, is that a lot of people go to quote unquote self-defense schools and without doing much research just believe that the person that is there has experience and will be able to actually teach them how to defend themselves, when in reality the vast majority of people that are teaching quote unquote self-defense have actually never had to defend themselves. So their kind of idea of what works, their idea of reality, is what they're training in the dojo, in the academy. That's the fullness of their experience. They've never actually had to engage in real interpersonal violence. And if they have, it's been, maybe once, maybe twice in their lifetime, probably when they were much younger at school, and it hasn't been a sustained experience. Now, I'm not saying for one second that, every single person out there that's teaching self-defense has to be engaged in the experience of interpersonal violence out on the street every single day to be taken seriously. But I do think that the people that you're learning from have to have had that experience. And, as much as I wish my life had turned out differently, I unfortunately grew up in an environment of violence. And then later on as an adult, I was immersed in the violent world of working the door in South Africa, which really isn't like working a door anywhere else in the world. I mean, outside of those nightclubs in South Africa, especially in Johannesburg, fighting is the norm. It's an every night occurrence. It's not something that happens every now and then. So if you like it or not, you have to, because your job entails that, you have to engage with that interpersonal violence, and you gain a lot of experience. I mean, I wish I didn't have to have gained the experience that way, but in one sense, it's a really good thing because I do teach martial arts, for maybe just an easy way to define it, as a full-time. That's my employment. That's what I do. That's my passion. And so having that experience does put me in a position that when I'm working with people, I'm being honest with them. And as you noted earlier, unfortunately, people don't want to actually hear the reality. The reality isn't nice. It's not, it's not going to unfold the way that people think it's going to unfold. It's definitely not the Jason Bourne movie where everything goes to plan, where somebody attacks you, you put in your countermeasures, your counter offense, and you eliminate the threat in front of you. More than likely, it's going to go south. There's going to be a whole bunch of other things involved, obstacles, potentially other people, multiple attackers, weapons involved. It's a chaotic environment. It's complex. And so having that experience, allows me to understand what it's actually like to be in that environment. And as much as people don't want to hear the reality, I'm at least talking from actually doing it, rather than just saying, well, my experience only comes from working in the dojo.
Yeah, yeah. It's when I'm working with students, I use the metaphor of preparing for rodeo. If you knew that in a month's time you were going to be on a rodeo show and you were going to be exposed to a horse that did not want you on its back, you wouldn't go and sit on a carousel because that lump of wood's horse shaped. You'd get on, at least you'd be getting on one of those mechanical bucking broncos, and so you could control the environment to some degree and make it progressive. But a lot of times people are sitting on these carousels spinning around thinking that they're ready for the rodeo.
Yeah, no, exactly. I agree.
Yeah. Rodney, seeing you mentioned this idea that you would not have wished the past that you had, and for a lot of people listening, they might not know very much about your past, and it's one of the most extraordinary parts of your journey. And I know you've told this before on other podcasts, but I wonder whether you might take us back to those early beginnings and your first exposure to interpersonal violence and how you managed that, what it was that set you on the path you've been on ever since.
Yeah, I'll give you the short version because there's, we could be here a while just unpacking this. Sure. But, making it brief, I was brought up on the south side of Johannesburg in government housing, very similar to the projects in the United States. I was brought up poor. My neighborhood was gang-ridden. The schools weren't safe. When you went to school, you had to try to escape and avoid the bullies. When I was coming home from school, I had to have routes to get home safely. Even when I got home wasn't safe. I was brought up by a single parent. My mother was a raging, abusive alcoholic, so I had to endure that as well. So my whole experience growing up was just completely immersed in violence, anxiety, aggression on all fronts, not just only from the school, not only from the neighborhood, but also in my home. And as time went on, the bullying got really bad. There was a time there where I thought of, killing myself because I thought there was no way out. And then when I became a teenager, my mother, in another drunken rage, actually kicked me out of the house, and I found myself sleeping on the streets and nowhere to go. I was around 17 years old, and literally I had to fend for myself. It was probably for about 6 months or so, and then I was able to actually enlist into the military, because back in those days in South Africa, going to the military was compulsory. You had to serve compulsory military service. I actually forged my mother's signature to get into the army. And so I entered into the army before my 18th birthday. I turned 18 in the military. And so I served my military service in the VIP protection wing of the military police in the South African Defense Force. We had counterinsurgents training. So later on, I served in counterinsurgents operations. And then during that period, I rose to the rank of platoon sergeant and actually became the hand-to-hand combat instructor for my unit. Because all the time through this experience and just going through this experience of being bullied, I was always trying to search for a way to defend myself against this. And naturally, one of the things that seemed the way to go was to learn martial arts. I had been training martial arts on and off since I was 6 years old.
Right.
And so coming into the military, I had a good background in karate and in Western boxing, and that stood me, in a positive light, and I was able to use those skills and ultimately take over the hand-to-hand combat aspect of the unit. And then once I got out of that, because I never finished high school, and I had these skill sets that pretty much the normal kind of run-of-the-mill companies are not going to employ, I had to find a job, and ultimately the only thing that I could find was actually working as a doorman. And so for the next several years, I worked, as I noted earlier, worked out some of the roughest nightclubs in Johannesburg, ultimately getting to the point where I ran all the contracts for these nightclubs, and I had about 70 odd doormen working for me.
So one of the things I find fascinating about this journey is that when you've risen to that position, and it is a position where there's a lot of ego stroking potentially, you're running an organization with other people working for you. There's potentially good money to be made. There's prestige, there's respect that comes with it. a lot of people would have attached themselves to that journey and just ridden it out. But there came to a point where you felt disillusioned or disenfranchised and made the decision to walk away from that. Was that a gradual experience that you had, or was there one particular day or experience that you had that said, right, this has to end because it's not serving my vision of what life should be for me?
Well, there was one incident that happened the one day. There was a lady that I knew. She was an advocate, so a high-powered attorney. She had come to this club a lot, and she was walking out one night. She had a couple of drinks, and she turned to me and she said, "Rodney, why are you working outside the door? I don't understand it, because you strike me as somebody that's, much better and has a lot of potential for the future. And I don't understand why you're actually doing this as a career." So that kind of stands out for me. That was kind of one of the turning moments for me.
Yeah.
But I think definitely the thing that what I started realizing was that, I'd come from an environment where I was on the receiving end of being bullied all the time. Now suddenly I found myself in a position where, not that I was bullying people because I was doing my job, but in essence, I was using violence to sort out a problem.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, it was like I had become the very thing that haunted me as a child that other people had done to me. And so that was kind of, something that just kind of got more and more amplified as each year went on. At the same time I was doing this, I was always trying to find a way to actually teach full time. And it was around about 1998 where somebody actually tried to take me out in a nightclub with a firearm. I was actually able to disarm that person, but it was very, very close. I mean, I felt the whiz of the round come right past my ear. I couldn't hear for a week. I mean, it was that close. And that was probably one of the biggest wake-up calls. I was like, do I really want to spend the rest of my life doing this? Being in the nightclubs, working as a doorman, working as a bouncer, is this as good as it gets? And I decided that I wanted to go full time, and I went into full-time martial arts, and I haven't really looked back since. But yeah, I can definitely, there were a lot of people that get completely sucked into that. It's a world that's hard to explain to somebody unless they've been there. This is the thing I say to people all the time. When either if you actually can or even perceive to be able to dominate other men in your environment, when you can physically dominate other men, you are automatically treated differently to everyone else. Now, be it fear, be it a false sense of respect, but I can quite easily see how people get addicted to that. It's almost like a drug.
Yeah, seductive.
It's very seductive. And that might be another discussion, but I see this happen a lot of times in martial arts too, where people can't actually do what they say they can do. But they realize that once they stand up in front of people and people perceive them as this fountain of knowledge, of all the self-preservation knowledge, and you don't ask questions a lot of times as students, you just, like I said earlier, you think or you expect the fact that the person teaching you actually has experience, has actually done it, but they haven't. We know that, students don't know that, but the student will treat the instructor differently.
Yeah.
And just like in the bouncing world, when you are seen to be able to physically dominate other men, you're treated differently. And sadly, a lot of people get off on that. I mean, it's a high for them.
Yeah. And I've also known that, I brushed the edges of this. The reason I was working the doors was as a secondary stream of income, but also because my karate teacher at the time, who had grown up working the doors in Liverpool in the 70s and 80s, pretty tough environment, not Johannesburg, but pretty tough by UK standards. And he said, look, you need to get out there and face non-compliant situations and get a sense of, real world violence. And so I was doing it just a couple of days a week for a year or so, just to kind of immerse myself in that environment to some degree. The people that had been there and worked a long time, they were saying that the trouble with this job is that when you go home, it doesn't finish. You are looking over your shoulder in your day-to-day life because you're going to piss off people, and some of those people are not going to be nice. And so breaking away from that world, even when you've decided you're not working the doors anymore, I think that there necessarily is going to be a heightened sense of awareness around your everyday life, because you're always wondering whether someone's going to try and take their revenge.
For
that
sure.
must take a
Yeah,
lot.
absolutely.
Must take a long time to sort of shake that off and put yourself in a position where you feel that you've moved beyond that or let that part of your life go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it took a long time, but in hindsight, I mean, it's a kind of a complicated discussion, right? Because there was a lot of things being mixed into this.
Yeah.
There were all the insecurities as a child, so what we could call the psychodynamic kind of forces, where the experiences that happened to you as a child now influence you as an adult. That was part of it, so that was there. Obviously, as you were describing, the nature of the job. So you never let it go. When you leave, you're looking over your shoulder because, you might have pissed off the wrong person. But I would think more than that, the biggest thing to shake, and I would say that I even experienced this just in martial arts in itself, is that it rewires you in a different way. So you become a very different person. I mean, as a doorman, you start to kind of never trust anybody. There's no trust. You very quick to get angry. Your trigger is very, it's very short. Before you know it, you'll fly into a kind of rage. And what you start finding is that kind of aggressive tendency starts infiltrating into your everyday life, and it starts showing up in the places you don't want it to show up, be it with your relationships, if you have children, with your children, and so forth. And so that's where I've seen a lot of people that have, quote unquote, immersed themselves in the world of violence, especially interpersonal violence. What tends to happen is they carry that with them, the things that change within them, because you naturally have to, because every night you're in a survival mode. You want to survive at all costs. You never know what's going to happen. You never know if it's just going to be this one person you're dealing with. Is there going to be multiple people? Is there going to be weapons involved? Are they going to follow you home? So your whole psyche changes. And that psyche is not conducive to living in the normal world. And it's that part that takes the longest part to overcome.
It's very interesting. I've just finished a book, and I'm gonna have to look it up and put it in the show notes to get the title right. But it was basically for people who, I think it was called the Idealist's Handbook or something like that. It was written for people who work in NGOs or overseas in high-risk environments where they're out there doing philanthropic work and they're trying to make a difference in the world, but they of course experience burnout, or often do. And one of the reasons that they're explaining is that if you have this low-level cortisol release that happens week on week, month on month, then your natural production of serotonin and all the kind of feel-good endorphins gets down-regulated, and you're basically you're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder without the trauma having been acute. It's a chronic experience, and I'm sure that people in security, close protection, working the doors can experience that same thing. And it's insidious because it works its way into your life very slowly without you realizing it. As you said, it's these small changes in your personality. Your fuse becomes slightly shorter. You become less trustful. And it's because you've got this kind of toxic chemical cocktail that's built up over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, as you noted, it sneaks up on you. You don't necessarily notice it immediately, but over time, if you're astute and you're aware, you can see the changes happening because you see how you engage with things in life that shouldn't make you upset.
Yeah.
But it does.
Yeah.
And near the end of my dormant years, it got to the point where literally, if I got into some kind of physical altercation with somebody, I wasn't even really feeling the adrenaline anymore.
Yeah.
It wasn't even noticeable. It was almost like it disappeared. That was very worrying to me because what it told me was that I had now got to the point where I had normalized the violence.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah, and that echoes a previous guest that I had, Andrew Marr, who experienced a traumatic brain injury following a detonation. He was a breacher in special forces, and he'd had a series of close calls, but this one was the thing that retired him from the Green Berets. And he said exactly the same thing. He said that guys who were in Rangers or SEAL teams or in the Green Berets would get to this point where they didn't feel fear. And rather than that would on the surface look like it was an attractive option, right? Now I've dealt with the fear, I can do my job. But he was saying, no, that's the point where you need to step out because you're a liability to your teammates at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, because that fear, you need that fear to make sensible decisions. Once that fear is gone, you rash and you make irrational choices and decisions that ultimately will not only get yourself into trouble, but when we're talking about, for example, special force operators, that's obviously going to affect your teammates.
Yeah.
So that was always interesting to me. But I also found that, I mean, it's part of this discussion, I guess, but I also found that once I left working the door and I got heavily involved in what was then the beginning stages of mixed martial arts, definitely in South Africa. And I found myself just totally consumed in the hyper competitive environment.
Yeah.
I found a very similar experience, and that was really the catalyst for me changing the way that I teach martial arts, because I got heavily involved in MMA, the hyper competitive cycle. We had a lot of people competing. They were doing very well. I was going into the academy night after night, being challenged, never ever getting beaten. But I found that what was happening was that besides the fact that I was winning all the time and I should feel confident, in control, and my self-esteem should be at a really good level, I found the opposite happened. And that actually I was more afraid, more apprehensive, more insecure with myself. And I was thinking to myself, how is that possible? If I'm winning all the time, this shouldn't be happening. I should feel like I've got my shit together, so to speak. But that wasn't the case. And my realization was that I had drifted so far into the martial, and I let go, if we can call it the art, the softer skills that is always promoted within the martial arts experience. And if you go down what I call the red road, where you're just only focusing on the fight and the best way to dispense with an opponent in front of you, in my experience, it starts creating psychological problems. You have a psychic split. And that was my experience. And it wasn't until I started balancing that out and realized that you can both be functional and realistic in your training, but healthy, positive, and balanced at the same time, and see the other side of the martial, the art aspect, then you can actually put yourself in a position where it actually is a positive experience. But if you just go down that one road, if you just go down the martial road, you're heading for disaster.
And you developed that idea beautifully in a blog, and I'll put in the show notes. I'll put a link to the post where you talk about an often unspoken element of people involved, particularly in so-called reality self-defense arena, where anxiety, depression, self-doubt, there's a lot of negativity that can come up, that you get this double bind, because people are kind of dipping their toes in this sort of toxicity of interpersonal violence, but they're not owning that because they think that the perception they need to present to their client base is of someone who's in control and powerful and alpha. And so they don't even get to talk about those things, so they repress it down. And so you get this split again between the self they're presenting and the self that they're actually feeling when they step off the dojo and go back into their everyday lives.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a very courageous post.
It's not exactly going to be accepted by saying things like that. I think it's quite controversial, actually. I mean, if I reflect back in my experience and through my life, I mean, for me, the reason why I went into martial arts, outside of the obvious part that I had to learn how to defend myself, but it was about trying to reclaim my personal sovereignty. I felt powerless.
Yeah.
And I see this a lot of times in the martial arts world, especially among people who teach, that this bravado, this alpha maleness, this meatheadness, it's just a facade. Really what they are fundamentally looking for is a sense of confidence, being in control, being disciplined, being balanced. But they think that by going purely into the fight, by what they think is confronting their fears, that all these things that they don't like about themselves, which is the opposite to all those things I described, the low self-esteem, the fear, the anxiety, if they confront those fears in a physical fight, that somehow that's going to be able to negate those inner shadows that they are running away from, and that they'll wake up the next morning and it'll be gone. In my experience, by purely focusing on the fight, what you end up doing is all those things that you're running from amplify. They get a whole lot worse. And so it's not the way to go. But it makes a whole lot of sense, though, because as we know through, if we look at, for example, neuroplasticity, we know that the kinds of experiences that you engage in is going to rewire your brain. It's going to change your brain structure. And when your brain structure changes, it changes who you are and how you feel about yourself. It's going to change your personality. So if you are suffering from low self-esteem and anxiety and fear and so forth, and you go into this environment that is all about violence, rather than teaching you how to manage that more effectively, by the mere fact that you're constantly expressing the very thing you're trying to get away from, you are rewiring your brain to be more like that. And so that was my experience, is that rather than becoming less violent, I was becoming more violent. But as I was becoming more aggressive, rather than being more confident, I was feeling this, the only way to describe it, complete, utter destruction inside, of where my self-esteem was so low and my self-concept was completely fractured and falling apart, and I lost all personal sovereignty. And I had to come to that realization in my own journey to find the balance point, like I was saying earlier, between the martial and the art, to finally come back to a place where I do and feel completely in control of my life, but I've done it in a way that honors both the martial and the art.
Absolutely. There's two things I want to pick up on there. There's so many directions we can go here. The first one is just a straightforward doffing my cap in respect to the branding around Crazy Monkey Defense, because it perfectly captures that idea of playfulness. So if we're going to follow a congruent path that allows us to experience mastery in our day-to-day life and movement, as well as application that can be used in the face of genuine interpersonal violence, then we need to get this interplay, this a path that is functional but playful. And Crazy Monkey Defense, I think, nails that beautifully. But the other thing I wanted to observe there is this, the Nietzsche quotation about whoever fights monsters needs to be aware of not to become a monster in the process themselves. There is a middle ground, isn't there? And I think you hit it perfectly between a true self-preservation or self-protection program would begin with breathing, and then it would look at diet, sleep hygiene, lifestyle choices, meditation or mindfulness training, awareness training, de-escalation and communication skills, and then you would look at combative strategies. It would not be about how to manage someone pummeling your head in. And we so easily can miss that if we take the art out of the martial.
For sure. And so if somebody asks me, well, give me an example of that. Give me an example of what you're talking about. From my experiences growing up, one of the hang-ups that I've always had is that I have a natural tendency to be aggressive. And that's just something that was part and parcel of my experience growing up and dealing with bullies, is that I found that, if you were the berserker and you were super aggressive, or at least were perceived to be, it was a really good defensive mechanism for people to leave you alone. But as I grew up as an adult, I had a very short fuse. The trigger was very, very close to being pulled all the time. And I would find myself just derailing into aggression for absolutely nothing. And so one of the things that I've worked really hard on in my experience in martial arts is to, for example, if we take sparring, to be in a sparring environment where I'm dealing with somebody that's a very good opponent and has the potential to best me, and maybe even is doing that in that experience, is actually doing really, really well. Naturally, in those moments, all your insecurities are going to rise to the top. And one of my insecurities is the fear of being dominated. And that's where my aggression comes from.
Right.
I feel it rising. I feel it coming up. But now rather than buying into it and expressing it and allowing it to come out and using it as fuel, I'm able to observe it, to manage it in that moment, and not to attach to it, which really comes to what you were talking about as far as being mindful. And so that the fact that I can be at a still point in the midst of a battle without buying into or expressing my anger is a powerful place to be. And that has done amazing things for me, not only obviously on the mat, and ironically, I'm better today as a fighter, if we want to just use that as a way to describe it, than I was in my early 20s. And I mean, I really thought I was that good in my early 20s, because in my early 20s, even when I was traveling around the world, and some of the people that came to my seminars have gone on to fight in the UFC and so forth, I've sparred world champions and you name it across the globe. I've never been beaten. But the fact of the matter is, I am much better today than I ever was back then, because back then I was fighting out of aggression and fear.
Yeah, which can get you so far, but at a high cost. Yeah.
Well, the high cost is to you personally.
Yeah.
It's when you're not on the mat. It's when you're not in the ring. It's when you're in everyday life. That's where the high cost is.
Yeah,
and you walk around with that all the time. It's a heavy load to carry on your back.
Yeah, well, I think one of the Buddhist metaphors is the idea that carrying hatred's a bit like picking up hot coals to throw them at your enemies. That you're the one that gets burned, whether it hits them or not. You get burned. And working from that place of aggression, and you talked about kind of berserker energy. Can work. It can be an effective strategy, and therefore we lean into it because it's got us out of hot spots in the past. I've also had a definite temper issue growing up, and one of the reasons I studied martial arts was my dad hoped that it might instill some self-discipline. I thought he would just teach me how to become a better fighter so I could defend the family's honor more effectively. But the reality was he was hoping I'd learn to marshal that and direct it rather than just tapping straight into rage all the time, because it is so self-destructive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rodney, one of the things I read in preparation for our conversation was your book Full Contact Living, which I highly recommend to people listening, and you identify 6 principles that interconnect beautifully. And I just wanted to linger for a moment on the foreword there, because it's written by Christian de Quincy, and if people don't know who he is, he's a very interesting academic and thinker around consciousness and exploring, the idea of humanity and who and what we might be. And a lot of people involved in reality-based martial arts would be surprised that your foreword came from this kind of an individual. And yet I know that he mentored you for some time, and that you have a great deal of respect for his point of view. Can you explain to me where that connection came from and how it informs Crazy Monkey Defense?
Well, actually, it was purely by chance. I was in a bookstore the one day and I was looking at books. I mean, this is something we can talk about. Most people don't realize that I'm also an academic, but it's not something that gets publicized a lot. But, so I love to read. I love to read those kinds of books, consciousness books, the mind-body problem and so forth. And I was looking in that section and there was a book and I pulled it out. It was called Radical Knowing. And I was just paging through the book just randomly, and it landed on a page. And the page just spoke to me. It was about this idea of pre-verbal consciousness and how your body has an intelligence of its own. As martial artists, we know that intuitively through our experience, but it was just amazing to be reading an academic style book with a very well-known philosopher who, in essence, is telling me on that page exactly the experience that I had. And so that's one of the reasons why I connected with Christian, and we have been friends now for several years. We've actually taught workshops together. But my interaction with him was to try to understand that part a whole lot better. I mean, I really wanted to get as deep into that as I possibly could, because it spoke to my experience as a martial artist, where you start to realize that actually the biggest kind of obstacle in performance is actually yourself, what you are thinking about. And if you can get out of your own way and allow your body to perform as it should, as a natural intelligence, the outcome is probably always, most of the time, positive, right? It's a positive outcome because you allowed yourself to get out of your own way. And that's really what he was talking about. And so that really started our friendship. And then, I studied under him for a while and just doing some of his mentorship program. And in that sense, I think what it did is that while I had these ideas and this intuitive understanding, it kind of gave the language that we needed to describe that experience. And so that's where Christian's work, I guess you could say, influenced the Crazy Monkey Defense experience.
Interesting. Because I had not come across his work. I'd actually come across some of his books, but just hadn't made the connection to the author, but read Blind Spots, I think it's called,
Yes.
about the way in which we can literally have kind of cognitive blind spots in the way that we think about things, which is, I think if every person read that book and every politician abided by some of the realities of it, we'd be in a lot better world right now. And he essentially advocates this idea of embodied mind performance, which I think is fascinating. And some people might see a connection with proprioception, this sort of subjective lived experience that we have. But anyone involved in a martial arts practice, or a number of people who listen to this are parkour athletes, they have a very similar experience, I think. It's this idea of a mind-body connection path, something where when you exercise or practice this, you are integrating mind and body, or rather experiencing the fact that you are a mind body, that there is no distinction between the two. And I've found that for me, that's been a place where I have been able to recharge my batteries, where I don't feel depleted at the end of that kind of practice. I feel charged and connected. And I wonder whether, did you purposefully therefore build the Crazy Monkey Defense curriculum around that idea? Because when I have watched video clips of guys training with you, they're often got big smiles on their faces, even though they're doing things that have high functional value.
No, absolutely. I mean, it informs the philosophy. I mean, you kind of mentioned it earlier when we were talking earlier on. You were saying about what Crazy Monkey and your impressions of it, right? Yeah. And so one of the things that I've tried to invoke in the training is that, yes, of course, we're training some serious material, but I want people to be training, day in and for weeks and months and years to come, right? And so if you're going to have people training for an extended period of time and you want them to be able to do that, you need to build an experience that is encouraging in the sense that it's something that they want to come back to every day, every night. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to go down that road of just the pure violence, I mean, there's only so much somebody can entertain that if you're just going down the world of reality-based self-defense. But eventually, it's going to get too much for the average person. But if I can build in this idea of challenge play, where you are working with people rather than against them, when you are on the mat and you are training with somebody, rather than seeing them as an obstacle to overcome, they actually the window to, developing your perfect game, because without that person in front of you, you actually have nobody to train with. You have nothing to work against. You have nobody to work with, which you need in order to achieve excellence. And so this idea of play, the idea of challenge, all these concepts start coalescing into the Crazy Monkey Defense experience, because I want people to be with me for years. I don't want them just to come in for a couple of weeks. I want them to be around several years down the road. And I know that if they do it that way, if they approach it that way, if that's the way they're going to train, the serious stuff they're going to eventually get. Mm-hmm. But in the process, what's far more important to me is how does the experience on the mat positively inform their life off the mat? Yeah. Because, the vast majority of people that train martial arts will likely never have to use what's been taught to them. Mm-hmm. But definitely the things that they are going to have to use is how to engage with what I call the martial arts of everyday life. Yeah. Be it a boss that's aggressive, or, toxic relationships at work, or any of those kinds of things. And it could be interpersonal situations that are not necessarily violent, but are verging on bullying and so forth. How you manage yourself in those experiences it's just as important. It's not any less important than learning how to defend yourself. So, of course you want people to learn how to protect themselves, and that's one of the most important things about training in a martial arts environment. But I also think is that giving people the tools, equipping them how to deal with that martial arts of everyday life, what I call, the full contact living experience that we all live in, and being able to manage that more productively, more proactively, in a calm, sensible, mindful way, those tools will stay with them forever. So that's something that they will get to use 23 hours of every single day that they're not training with me.
For me, I think one of the reasons I'm such a champion of integrated mind-body practices, whether it is martial arts or parkour, or there are many different expressions that people can embrace. One of the reasons I think it's so important is that I think it becomes allegorical. So for parkour practitioners, for example, they find obstacles in their environment and then skillfully find ways to move through them. And they often talk about the fact that when they've spent a while practicing physically, they find that their response to obstacles in everyday life that are non-physical, like an aggressive boss or a financial challenge, they have more flexibility. And it seems to be directly attributed to the fact that they've got this lived, embodied practice. And I think it's the same in the martial arts as well, that when you deal with challenge, conflict, someone giving you resistance and working with it, you become more empowered to work with different forms. I think it does transfer across domains to some degree.
Oh, absolutely. And what it tends to do is it changes your perception of things.
Yeah.
That's really what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know through research that, for example, if I take somebody who does parkour and I make them stand at a distance to a wall, and so you can't really judge how high that wall is effectively. Mm-hmm. And I say to them, kind of show me with your hand how high this wall is. Parkour practitioners will always place the wall lower than it actually is, compared to if I say, for example, take somebody who does no physical exercise and I make them stand at a distance to a wall and I say, how high do you think that wall is? They will always place it higher than it actually is. Mm.
Yeah.
So then if that's how you're perceiving the world, then that means that how you're going to perceive obstacles in the world is going to be very different. And the reason why you're going to see it differently is because you have this embodied experience that you engage in that changes the way that you interact with the world. Mm. And, you see lots of examples of that. I mean, if you talk to people who train at my academy, they will say that through training in the academy, when they go into everyday life, how they hold themselves is very different. They stand up more upright, their shoulders are back, they are able to look at people in, eye to eye, not looking down at the floor, and so forth. And all these are crucial skills that changes the interpersonal dynamic of people in everyday life. And where they're actually getting it is by actually training, quote unquote, in a fighting discipline where most people wouldn't see that connection. They would be like, I don't see how going to train in a martial arts academy, how is that actually going to help you in your everyday life? But once you've actually gone through that experience and you understand the mind-body connection and how it changes your perception, both of yourself and of obstacles and, anything that stands in your way, everything else in your everyday life changes as well. I mean, I hear this all the time from students where they'll say things like, well, if I can be in the academy and I have somebody punching at me and I have to defend all these punches coming at me and I can stay calm in the midst of that storm, then when that comes up in my everyday life, obviously not in a physical sense, nobody's punching at them, but I'm confronted with an obstacle, it just doesn't seem that difficult to overcome.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other thing that it offers is we talked earlier about the seductive draw of environments where, as a man, you get to dominate other men. And one of the things I found about a martial practice is that it offers you an alternative and positive experience of embracing power and an expression of power, but without being about dominating. It's about partnership. So most good training groups have a sense of community where you're valued for who you are and for your output and your effort. But it's done in a way that is not ego-driven, that we test each other so that we can grow rather than try and dominate someone else just for the sake of saying I'm the top dog here.
I think exactly as you described it. I mean, that's the ideal setting.
Yeah.
That would be the ideal way of setting up a training environment. And those are going to be some of the outcomes of that. Unfortunately, I would argue too that most modern schools of martial arts, especially in the reality-based self-defense world, tend not to be like that. And the reason is because they have foregone the philosophy. Yeah. They've basically just focused themselves completely into the fight. They all into the martial. I mean, if you even mention any of the other stuff that we've talked about, they will pretty much switch off to it, which is really sad because they're missing a big part of the training, and that part of the training is the part that's going to inform their life off the mat in a positive way. Because when you talk to these people that train in these very kind of hardcore, extreme reality-based self-defense experiences, most of them have never actually been in a fight anyway. I mean, so that's not like they're actually living in the most dangerous parts of the world.
Yeah.
It's always interesting to me. If you did like a general kind of survey of the most extreme versions of reality-based self-defense, what you tend to find is they're not in the war zones of the world. They're not in the townships or the barrios or the favelas. That's not where they are. They're not in the projects.
Yeah. Because
they're more into the middle upper class neighborhoods of the world, right? So it's so interesting to me. So I mean, everybody needs to learn the skill of self-preservation. It's an absolute must skill because, like it or not, there are bad people in the world. But the bottom line is very few people will ever use it for that. And so then it makes sense that your training should be more than just about learning how to fight.
Yeah.
In essence, what you really want to develop is you want to become a champion in your everyday life. You don't, it's not just only about becoming quote unquote that champion in the ring or on the mat, that you can dispense with other people physically with martial technique. It's like, can you actually keep it together in everyday life? And we tend to see that a lot, right? Where people are very hyper competitive and, they might be very good in one sphere in the fight game, but everything else around them, the entire life is falling apart.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that happens is because they've kind of almost shut off to the art. They've put it aside. They don't see the value in it. And there's a detriment to doing that.
Rodney, if people are listening to this and saying that they'd love to come and check out what you do, but they're not based in Johannesburg, there are other instructors who have trained with you and opened up Crazy Monkey schools elsewhere in the world. Can you just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, my program now is in 15 countries around the world. It continues to grow. I think the reason why it's becoming so popular is because we really work hard to find this balance, between the functional and ensuring that we have a healthy philosophy. We've got both the martial and the art. And so I think that's the reason why it's so popular. People like to come into an environment where anybody is welcome, regardless of where they've come from, their background, their fitness level, their age. We have people all the way from kids right through to people training in their 60s. And that's a positive experience. And they know that they can get on the mat and nobody's going to try to hurt them.
Yeah.
Because we just never, ever allow those kinds of experiences to unfold on the mat. A lot of people talk about these things, but unless you enforce it, unless you are on top of it as a trainer, it's not going to unfold by itself because naturally you're going to be dealing with a lot of different personalities and people have a backstory, just like I was talking about my backstory.
Yeah.
And I remember, maybe I'm going a little bit off on a tangent, but I remember when I was coming up and I was training with certain people, I was exhibiting what I now know is, not the best way to be presenting myself anywhere, especially on the mat or in the world for that matter. But yet nobody ever turned around to me and said, hey, Rodney, why are you expressing yourself this way? There's another way to do it. Or at the very least say, what happened? Why are you like this? What's the backstory? And so I try to, and all my trainers try to take each person as an individual and say, well, if this person comes in highly aggressive, there's a reason that's happening, right? There's a backstory. And our job as a trainer is first to deal with that. Forget about teaching this person how to fight because actually that's probably going to be the worst thing for them. If we can teach them how to manage that aggression more effectively and become calm on the mat, the rest will take care of itself. And I think that approach is very different to how a lot of people present the modern martial art experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I'm a school teacher by day, and when I'm working with incidents of bullying, there's a tendency, of course, to gravitate towards protecting the victim, but the reality is that the most work needs to be done with the bully because they're in pain to be exhibiting that kind of behavior. So we make sure we interrupt as soon as possible their behavior patterns and protect the more vulnerable members of our community, but we spend a significant amount of our time trying to look at where where that person's power has leaked to the point where they feel they need to inflict grief on someone else in order to feel valued themselves. I'm sure that's very similar. If you bring someone into a training environment where they're in pain, then that's where you've got to work first.
I agree. I mean, because just now that I know better, right, and now that I, in hindsight and as an adult and in my 40s, I can reflect back to those bullies, and I realized that what's really going on at that time was that they had no sense of power. They felt powerless.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why they were exhibiting those behaviors. And that should have been dealt with, and it never was. But I think we do know better today, and there's a lot of research to back that up. And so I try to bring that in. I try to ensure that that's the way that we want to approach martial arts. I want people to train hard. Don't get me wrong. I want people to challenge themselves, but I want it to be done in such a way that it's respectful and that the person never feels that they're going to be hurt. And that also at the same time that they are allowed to express the way that they feel. Now, I know like a lot of times when people hear that, especially in the modern martial arts world, they're like, oh my God, here we go, these hippies, right? But what's wrong with saying if this particular experience makes me afraid? Mm-hmm. At least if we start from that point and you're saying this experience makes me terribly afraid, be it sparring, for example, for a lot of people. Well, now I can start at a place where I know that you are afraid of this experience, and I can now structure the training in such a way, and we've done this so many times, where we have taken somebody who's been so afraid of that personal engagement with another human being in the martial sense, and have worked them through a process to ultimately where they feel completely calm, relaxed, and focused and able to do it. And some of those people have gone on to be some of our best trainers and best students. But then again, there's a backstory there, because when you sit and you talk to some people, I can think of one example where I had a female student was having a real hard time in sparring. It was freaking her out. But once I actually sat down with her and, just on the side in confidence and spoke to her, eventually she told me that she had been sexually abused, and at the same time, her ex-husband used to beat her up. Well, now you can completely understand why she feels the way that she feels and why she's exhibiting certain kinds of behaviors on the mat and why it's so tough for her. And understanding that is really important. And so now I can restructure the way that we train and do it in a way, and we did that. And it helped her immensely, because why is she there? She realizes that, she's lost her power and that some man took that power away from her, and she wants to get it back.
And what an incredible...
So that's why she's come to train, right? And so my job is to help her.
Yeah, and what an amazing demonstration of courage that in the face of all of that, she chooses to step into an arena where she knows she's going to face triggers for the suffering she's had in the past, and she still turns up. Really, there's courage and bravery, isn't it?
And to acknowledge that's important, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. And you can go on and on and on. Maybe a guy comes in, is super aggressive. He's finding it really hard to calm down. When you talk to him on the side in confidence, the backstory is he was bullied his whole life, and that's why he's just full of anxiety and rage at the same time. And doesn't know what to do with it, and thought if he comes and trains martial arts, that will help him overcome it, because he still has that insecurity with other men in everyday life. He still feels that he's being dominated by other men. Maybe not, in a physical sense anymore, but just because he has all these hang-ups, he feels like he can't stand up for himself. He has no personal sovereignty anymore. My job as a coach is to help that person work through that. And I think that's what most trainers should be doing. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people who teach martial arts don't necessarily think of it in such a broad way. A person comes in, pays them money, they do the lesson, and that's the last time they think about that person. I don't want to be that kind of coach. I don't want my trainers to be like that either. And I think that's one of the ways that we have become very successful in what we do, and why we have people teaching my program all over the world, is because we genuinely care about the people on our mat. It's not just somebody who's paying us a fee every month.
Absolutely. Well, I'll make sure that obviously all the links are in the show notes. I'm aware we're coming up on time, Rodney. I just wanted to To finish off our conversation, I know that you are widely read. I wondered whether you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey, just because that underpins the Hero Forge project to a degree. And I just wanted to make a kind of parallel to the journey you've been on and Campbell's idea of the monomyth or the hero's journey. Is that something you know about?
It's kind of interesting that you say that. I was actually talking about that 2 days ago. Absolutely. I'm very well aware of Joseph Campbell's work, The Hero's Journey. We're all on a hero's journey. We're all facing obstacles. We all need teachers. We all need a challenge. But I think that, and you know this, and that's the kind of thing I try to tell all my trainers all the time, is that we're all going through the steps of the hero's journey, but you're really not a hero or even a warrior for that matter, unless you come back to the society that you came from.
Exactly.
And that you bring back what you learned, what you had learned from your experience. So, it's meaningless unless you do that. It's a narcissistic personality kind of process going on where it's all about you. And that's not really what a hero is. A hero is somebody who, has the trials and the tribulations, goes through that experience, learns from that experience, comes back with this knowledge, and then imparts that with other people so they don't have to make the same mistakes. And that's really what's the exciting part about being a coach, is that I can be on the mat with my students and go, you know what? Been there, done it, got the T-shirt, and I can tell you how this thing is going to go down.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so,
and your life embodies that.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's one of the reasons I was so keen to talk with you, is that you look at your journey from, the call to adventure being one where you were thrown into that chaos. It's not something you wanted to be involved in, but you traveled into this other realm where you had to kind of struggle to survive, and you had all these formative experiences. And then the innermost cave, in my opinion, of your journey was when you were, working the doors and doing all of that stuff where you were staring into the abyss. And yet you've come out, you have this elixir, Crazy Monkey Defense, that you've managed to find the jewel within all that ugliness, and are now sharing it as widely as you can and on all the platforms you do. And it's something that I really wanted to celebrate, because a lot of people get stuck in that cave, and you've come out the other side, and it's come with its scars. And you've mentioned to me on our previous communications about, you have aches and pains from the journey you've been on, but my goodness, you're making a difference.
Well, no, I appreciate it. And that's kind of what I want to do for everybody else. Is so, they might have to go into that cave. I think you have to do that if you're on the hero's journey. But at least when you come out from the other side, you've come back with something that's worthwhile, life affirming, and will change your life and everybody else's life around you in a positive way.
Exactly. That sounds like a perfect point for us to end this conversation. For the people listening, I know they'd have got a lot from this, but I really appreciate you giving up your time. And this is the first time we've chatted, but I feel like I've known you for a very long time. We're definitely kindred spirits in terms of our philosophy and points of view. So thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.